Hello and welcome to today's Salesforce.com webinar, Full Force with Force.com, Beyond the Basics. Here we have our safe harbor statement. When making any business decisions with our platform, consider only existing functionality. For more information, visit our website at Salesforce.com and search for Safe Harbor. I'm Rachel Talent, Director of America's Training and Certification here at Salesforce.com, and I'm joined today by Chris Berry, Master Technical Instructor who has trained many developers. Today, Chris and I will show you how you can take your developer skills and your Salesforce implementation to the next level. We want you to get more out of the investment you've made in Salesforce.com. To begin, ask yourself these following questions. Would you like to automate more business processes? Have you reached the limits of what's possible via the setup menu features? Are you always on the hunt for new and innovative ideas to improve your Salesforce implementation? The Force.com platform has many features for developers to take advantage of, which can automate common repetitive business processes for your end users. During this webinar, we'll only be covering a small portion of the power available to you as a Force.com developer. The three areas we'll look at are introduction to Apex code syntax, utilizing triggers and SOCL to achieve business goals, and understanding governor limits. Before we begin, let's take a quick poll. Are you currently using Apex triggers in your org? Yes or no? We'll give you another minute or so to enter your information and see where we end up. Great. Thanks for taking the poll. Interesting feedback. So, Chris, let's take a closer look.
Sure, Rachel. The problem we're looking at today was an actual issue that a customer in one of my previous classes presented to me. First, a little background. At this organization, the owner of each lead record was the sales representative tasked with the following up with a prospect. Each sales representative was assigned to a geographic region, like West, Central, or East. A custom field of type pick list on the user object stored this key piece of data. I'm going to exit out to my web browser to show you what this looks like in terms of a user account. So here within the org that I'm using for demo purposes, out here under Manage Users, and then Users is the account that I'll be using today, which is simply my name, Chris Berry. If I click on this user account here, you'll see that down here there is a custom field on each user account, which is the region. If I click on Edit here, this is simply a pick list with the available regions, like I said, East, Central, and West. So if I were a sales rep, I would have my region associated with my user object. Oh, let me get back there. So the customer had a straightforward business requirement. The sales manager needed a report, leads by region. First, we discussed having the sales reps manually enter the region data on the lead record. Although easy from an implementation standpoint, this had two major drawbacks. First, this would be extra busy work for the sales rep, adding very little value from their perspective. This would have negative effects on user adoption. Second, anytime there are two copies of the same data without an automated validation taking place, there's the possibility of dirty data. A lead might change ownership, but the sales rep may forget to change that field value. The generated reports may be inaccurate, reducing trust in the data. So we decided to look for a declarative solution, and by that I mean using some feature from the setup menu.
I'd be interested to know which features our audience might investigate in the setup menu to solve this problem. So let's take a moment to take another quick poll. What feature would you take advantage of if you wanted to solve this problem? A custom report type with a lookup field, a cross-object formula field, a workflow rule with a field update, or some other option? We'll give you just a minute to enter your information. Thanks for entering your information. So, Chris, let's take a look at some of the different options that people selected.
Okay. One thing I always stress in Apex class is the golden rule of Force.com development. Always attempt to solve a problem declaratively before attempting a programmatic solution. The first place we looked was a custom report type, since the goal was to report on data. One feature of a custom report type is to add related fields via lookup to the list of available columns. Unfortunately, custom fields on the lead owner are not available via this feature. The screenshot shows this, the one that I'm displaying right there. Another place we looked was to include the owner's user data on the lead via a cross-object formula field. Unfortunately, you cannot traverse up to the related user object via the owner field on the lead. The screenshot here shows that it ends with the owner ID. We tried the same thing in a workflow rule that performed a field update but ran into the exact same problem when attempting to access the user object via the owner field.
What about using roles or territory management?
Those are definitely viable options that should be explored. In this case, though, their role hierarchy was not geographically based, and they had decided against implementing territory management.
So it looks like you tried to solve the problem via clicks. What about solving the problem with code?
A programmatic solution was our next step. Apex is an automated but flexible technology. Using a trigger, we were able to accomplish our goal. A trigger is similar to a workflow rule in the sense that it is executed upon a write operation to the database. A trigger will intercept the data being written to the database and allow us to do a number of things, like modify records before they are written to the database, create entirely new records, share records with users, or other types of actions. Rachel, on our developer learning path, we show both beginning and experienced programmers how to utilize triggers.
Let's take another quick poll to see how knowledgeable people are about Apex triggers. Are you new to Apex triggers and new to object-oriented programming? New to Apex triggers but have experience with object-oriented programming? Have some knowledge but would like to know more? Or know a lot about Apex triggers? Thank you very much. We'll take just a minute for you to fill out the information. Perfect. Thanks so much. Chris, tell us a little bit more about the solution.
Fantastic. Looks like people are interested in learning more. We architected a solution that copied the region data to the lead object, but our solution did not require extra effort on the part of the sales reps, nor was it subject to errors that might result from manual replication. First, we created a new custom field on the lead object to hold the region data as shown in the diagram above. Second, we created an Apex trigger which did two things. It queried the user table in the database to obtain the region data based on the ID of the owner. Then it populated the region value on the lead record with the region value we found in that user table. Thus, every time a lead was written to the database, our trigger would auto-populate the correct region. Our sales manager would now have the necessary data to run the leads by region report.
Okay, but how did you actually code that in Apex?
That's the fun part. We used a special system variable, trigger.new. In our developer courses, we explain many more system variables in addition to trigger.new, which are unique to the Apex environment. Trigger.new provides us a mechanism for accessing the input records, which in our case are leads. Now you'll notice I said records. Trigger.new is not just a single record, but a list of records. This is because a trigger might be fired by the save of a single record or the concurrent save of multiple records. An example of how multiple records might be written to the database as one operation is data loader. Our trigger, which is called lead region, will read this system variable to get the ID of the owner and then write the value of the owner's region back to the records in trigger.new.
The lead won't yet contain the owner region value though, right?
That's correct. We're going to need to query the database to get that value because it exists on a different record. That is where the Salesforce.com object query language, or more commonly referred to as SOQL, comes in. SOQL is based on SQL, the structured query language, the standard language for relational databases. SOQL is similar to SQL, but also different, mainly because Force.com runs on a multi-tenant database. There are many differences, so we spend a lot of time discussing and working with SOCL in our developer courses on Apex. Back to our use case, though, our trigger will need to query the database to get the value of the region field based on the owner's user ID. Now let's take a look at our code. I'm going to exit out to a folder which contains some sample code that I've already written. I'm going to go through 3 versions. So I'm going to start off with the first version of my trigger right here and open this up. All right, so let's take a look at some code. This is the lead region trigger. It is declared on the second line up there, trigger lead region on lead. Every trigger is associated with a specific type of S-object. In this case, this one's associated with lead, and that is identified by the part of the code which says on lead. The next 2 things that you see are before insert and before update. These are the events that will fire the trigger. In this case, whether a new record is being created, in other words, an insert, or before a record, or execute the code before a record is being updated in the database, in other words, anytime a modification is being made to a record or multiple records. The next thing that we have on line 5 is a for loop. The way you would read this is for each lead that I call L temporarily in trigger.new, we're going to execute some code. Remember that I said trigger.new is a list of records, in this case a list of leads. So the for loop in this case will iterate through the list of leads which are about to be written to the database. As we iterate through the list of leads, we're going to give it that temporary name of L. Now inside the for loop, here we have a SOCL query. And what we've done is we're going to query, and let me just highlight this for you. So this portion right here, the one inside the square brackets, that's our database query. We're going to query for the region value from the user table where the ID is equal to the ID of the owner of the current lead. And that's exactly what this line of code is right here, including the colon, which is really giving us the ability to reference that variable which exists within our Apex code. The final thing that we do is on line 11, what we do is for the current lead, we set the value of the region field equal to the value of the region field on the user record, which is associated with our owner. And so now we've updated our lead with that region from the user table. Let's test this out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back over here to my leads tab, or I'm sorry, I'm going to first need to copy my code up. So I'm simply going to do a Control-A and then a Control-C, and then go out to my setup menu. And here under Customize Leads, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new trigger. So I'm going to click on the trigger link and then click on the New button to create the lead. I'm sorry, to create the trigger. This will bring me to the window where I can edit the trigger code. Now, normally in class, we're going to be using the force.com IDE, but because this is a quick demo, I'm simply going to use the web browser mechanism to write code. In my case, this is some pre-built code, so I'm simply going to do a Control-V and paste over the content of my code and then save it. What's happening? This is being written to my org's metadata database. You'll notice that the trigger is currently active. I'm doing this in a sandbox, by the way. You can't edit code directly in a production environment. You need to use our deployment process to get it up there. Now let's test this out. So I have an activated lead. What I can do is I can click on the Leads tab, and I'm simply going to create a new lead. So I clicked on my New button, and I'm going to enter in the required fields that I have here. I'll just use my own last name and Salesforce.com, and then click on the Save button. Now, one thing I want to point out is that the region field, because this is a new record, is currently blank. One of the things you could do alternatively is either via the page layout, protect this by setting it to be read-only, and therefore the user would not be able to enter it in here. Or you could utilize something like field level security also to protect this field. Now in my case, I just set this up as an editable field, but I'm going to leave it blank during here. But you could do some other stuff to make it a non-editable field. When I click on my Save button now, what's going to happen is the record will be saved to the database. Now take a look at the region. What happened was by saving this record to the database, my trigger was fired because this was an insert into the database. My code was executed. It executed my SOQL query into the database for the user table. It found the region value and then copied that to the region field of my lead and then ultimately allowed the save to the database to occur.
Let's find out what percentage of our audience is familiar with database programming via SQL. We're going to put a poll question up and just let us know. Great. Thanks so much for responding. So Chris, is our trigger complete?
Actually, it isn't. Because the Force.com platform is a multi-tenant solution, Apex code runs under governor limits. These limits exist so that inefficient code does not slow down the performance for the entire system. In an on-premise web application, typically code would be optimized during a rigorous testing process. For instance, one of the purposes of load testing is to detect problems in application scalability before code is deployed to production. The Force.com platform goes the extra step of explicitly requiring that code not overutilize system resources. Governor limits are frequently misunderstood. They are applied per request, and therefore they promote efficiency and not daily utilization of the Force.com platform. There are many different governor limits, and they are applied differently depending upon the situation. So in our developer classes on Apex, we spend a lot of time discussing them and point out ways to write more efficient code. Let's take a look at a modification that we can make in the lead region trigger so that we don't exceed the governor limits. I'm once again going to exit out to Windows Explorer, and this time I'm going to open up a second version of my lead region trigger. This one is different, and the key change that we made was really on line 13. And the reason that this difference is so important is that we move the query to the database outside of our for loop. Now, why is this something you'd want to do? Well, when you're executing a trigger, there's a limit of a total of 20 separate queries that you can do or perform against the database. In our for loop in the previous version, if we would have had more than 20 records in trigger.new, so let's say, for instance, we're writing to the database via data loader and we simply have 25 records, we're going to exceed the governor limit and an error will be returned to the person using data loader. What I've done is I've optimized the code so that that situation will not occur. So let's take a look at line 4. I declared a new set. A set is a collection of elements. In this case, they are record IDs, and I called that owner IDs. Now, my for loop, I actually have two different for loops. The first for loop is going to collect all of the IDs of the owners and place them inside that set. The reason I'm doing this is that later on in my query, so on line 13, here I have the query which goes out to the database, but there's a key difference between this query and the previous one, and it has to do with my where clause. Notice that I'm checking or I'm querying the database where the ID is in my set of owner IDs. I am not doing a one-off query where I'm checking to see where each ID is equal to a single one. This is a bulk query. And when you're writing Apex, you need to always write your code. We call it bulkification, but write your code so that it can handle bulk amounts of data because that's something that you'll frequently be doing on the Force.com platform. So now, even if I have 25 records, my query will only be executed once and will go out and get all the user records associated with all the different owners. Now, I do a little trick here. This is a little coding shortcut on line 16. What I do is I populate a map with the users that I got back from my query. And what this does is this parses out the ID, the record ID of all those users, and places it within a map. A map is a correlation. It's another type of collection which correlates a key to a value. In this case, the key is the ID of the user, and the value is the actual user record. Now, you'll notice that I have another for loop down here. What this is doing is this is once again iterating through trigger.new. What we're doing here is we are updating the region value for every lead, and what we're doing is we're utilizing that map. The get method will do the lookup in the map based on the ID of that user, and then this dot notation here will return the value of the region. And so in this case, what we're doing in this for loop is populating, once again, all of our leads region value with the value that we found in the database.
Thanks, Chris. Is that all?
Actually, there are a few more things that we could do with this code that are beyond the scope of this short webinar. One such thing would be to implement exception handling, and let me show you that. All right. I'm going to once again exit out here and open up a third version of my lead region trigger. Now, in this third version, the difference is really down here in this last for loop. You'll notice that I've added a bunch more code. In fact, the key thing is that there's a few if statements. All right, let me show you the first if statement. The first if statement has to do with the exception condition, which is a lead may not be associated with a user. For those of you who are familiar with our platform, records can be owned not only by users, but by queues. And so what we've done is we've checked, does our map contain a key for this owner ID? In other words, did we find a user in the database? If we don't, we're going to set the value of the region field equal to not assigned to a user. The other exception condition we would have is that, let's say that perhaps whoever set up this user account forgot to enter in data for the region field. In that case, the region field would be blank. And what we've done here is we've specified, okay, let's just set the value there to user has no region. Maybe on our reports we want to see leads that are assigned to sales reps, but sales reps that are not assigned to a particular region. So in this case, we've done some exception handling to check these fringe cases, in which case we do not find a region value on a sales rep when we did the query to the database.
There's a number of online resources available. So today we scratched the surface. Sorry about that little pause in the middle. We're going to take questions through the chat in just a minute. So if you want to start entering those in, go ahead and do it now. And we scratched the surface of our Apex triggers, but there's a lot more of this important technology. This topic is covered in much greater detail in 2 of our developer training courses. The first one is Introduction to Object-Oriented Programming Using Apex, or Dev 531, which is a new introductory course for those who don't have object-oriented programming experience. This course is a great first step for you experienced administrators who want to take your skill set to the next level. The second is for those of you who might already be familiar with an object-oriented programming language like Java or C#. It's called Apex and Force.com Pages Controllers, or Dev 501. In addition, we also have a course on the extensive declarative features we mentioned and much more, building applications with Force.com and Force.com Pages, or Dev 401. Finally, we have another new course, Force.com Integrations, Dev 502, on integrating Salesforce.com with your other applications. So what's next? I'd encourage you to think about how you're going to keep building your skills this year to get the most out of the Force.com platform. With a small investment up front, you can learn to take full advantage of your Force.com implementation. There are also a number of online resources available to you that are listed here, so make sure that you consider these options when planning out your training program. We're still compiling some questions here that we'll take to the chat, but I just want to take a moment so that you can see the special offer that we have. To help get you started, we're offering a promotion to webinar attendees. For a limited time only, you can take 10% off any public course. If you attend by July 31st, 2010, we'll also throw in an iPod Nano. You can see our class dates and locations on our website, or you can call to talk to one of our training specialists by calling 877-TRAIN-10. So thanks for your time today. We're happy to take questions, so please use your chat tool. If we don't get to your question during the webinar, we'll follow up individually to make sure that all questions are answered. The session is also being recorded so you can review it later or share it with a colleague. So one of the first questions that we have is, can you explain the triggers.new object more?
Sure. Trigger.new is a system variable that is only available within the context of triggers. Now, a trigger itself is a procedure which executes upon detecting one of those events that occurs to the table. Now, there's a little bit of a difference between a trigger and something like a class. Normally in object-oriented programming, you put all your logic within a class and you instantiate objects. So a class is like a template, and an object is an instance of that template. So for instance, your dog, Spot, Spot would be the object, an instance of a dog. Dog would be the class. Now, in the case of triggers, triggers are different. They are procedures, like I said, which are executed on those database rights. Now, one of the things that your triggers might do is utilize objects, so for instance, instantiate some other custom object in order to perform some tasks. Trigger.new happens to be a system variable, which in itself is a collection. It is actually specifically a list of all those records. So I hope that answered the question in terms of delineating the difference between those two.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Chris. We're just going to get to the next question in a second here. So the next question is, what if your owner, and I'm assuming this is on a lead, is a public queue? A follow-up question to that is, a workflow field update a better option?
Well, the problem with so that's exactly what that use case, which was, maybe this question was asked before I covered that particular thing, but that's exactly why we did that exception handling in the third version of our trigger, which was to take a look. Well, what if we don't find a user with that owner ID? We could set the value of the region field equal to, owner is a queue. In addition, why not use a field update? Well, it's sort of a unique, thing about the owner field, because it is going to two different tables. It can reference either a user or a queue, and queues are stored in a table called group. When we traverse up to the fields, it really doesn't know which direction to go. And so that's why we need to use the extra power of Apex in order to get those values back.
Thanks. Can you discuss test classes a little bit?
Definitely. So an important aspect of developing Apex is the creation of unit tests. Native within the Force.com platform is a unit testing framework, and it's actually a requirement because when you move your code into production, we have requirements in terms of test coverage. Now, in my case, in the lead region trigger, I was developing it in a sandbox. If I wanted to promote my trigger to production, I would need to create some test code which would call my trigger and run what we call a unit test. Now, the way that you do this in the Force.com platform is you would create a class, and the class would contain a test method. Now, in order to test a trigger, it's fairly straightforward. What you would do is programmatically you'd create some test data, something that we show you how to do within our classes. And then secondly, you would perform either an insert or an update to the database. When you do that, that will then fire off your trigger, and you will have successfully tested your trigger. So the same rules that apply to testing for classes within Apex also apply to testing triggers. And the way that we do that is in our test code, perform the either the insert or the update to the database to fire off your trigger.
Thanks. Another one of the questions is, can triggers be linked to call and respond to other triggers?
They are actually linked by default. So one of the things that is a part of developing Apex triggers is that you can have a sequence of cascading events. And this especially comes into play with governor limits. So let's pretend for a second that one of the things that my lead trigger would do would be to create a new opportunity. Now, if I would have created a trigger on opportunity to detect an insert, my lead trigger would then fire off my opportunity trigger, and those would execute under the same transaction context. Now, this is important because when we apply governor limits, we apply them per request. So each request that we have is reset for each transaction, and everything we did under the right of the lead and everything that we did under the right of the opportunity would be a part of that transaction context. So triggers are inherently linked in the sense that they are implicitly executed upon the events that you set them up to execute on. Now, that being said, you can't explicitly call a trigger, but if you did want to have reusable code that you wanted to explicitly call, you would simply move the definition of that code into a class, place it in a method, and then call that code from your trigger. In fact, I was just working on a project a couple of days ago, creating some code for internally here at Salesforce.com, and I had two use cases for reusing the same code. I called it from a trigger, and I called it from some batch Apex that I wrote, and what I was able to do was to reuse the code that I created in two different places. So if you do want to explicitly call something, the short answer is place it in a class.
Perfect, thanks. Can you just go back one slide? I have a question from a user who just wanted us to kind of go over the classes again.
Sure.
So our developer path really starts off with our Dev 401, and that is really writing applications from scratch using clicks, not code, and it also covers Force.com pages. From there, you're going to move on to Apex and Force.com controllers, or Dev 501, and that's the standard developer path. And then from there, move on to Force.com integrations. If you're new to object-oriented programming, the path that you would want to take is the Dev 401, and then moving down, you can see the dotted line into the introduction to object-oriented programming using Apex, or Dev 531. Then take a little bit of time, work in the application, use Apex, learn a little bit more, and then come back in to the developer path by taking the Dev 501. So if there were any other questions that came through the chat and weren't answered, we will definitely take those offline and make sure that you get your questions answered. Thanks so much for attending the webinar, and Chris, thanks for presenting.
Thanks all for attending. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, Rachel.